This is episode 9, I believe. I finished rather abruptly because the batteries went in the camera last time, but Gus had actually asked Bellinda for her history as they sat by the fire in the evening. He looked into her eyes in the flickering firelight. He said, "I want to know all about my new friend." Okay, where I am 21 years old. I graduated not too long ago from Southampton University, where I got a degree. My home is in Salisbury, where my mother is from. She was married to an Irishman called Thomas Devlin. I'm his daughter, Bellinda Devlin. He was an Irish Catholic and a Republican. He was interned in the Troubles and my poor mother was left with me. We lived in Belfast, a place called the Falls Road. You may have heard of that. Gus nodded. Oh yes, we've all heard of it. Well, we had good neighbours, Gus. Dad was a bit of a hero, so people looked after us. Mum liked the people, but she hated Irish politics. She says she could never really understand it. When I was 12, Dad was let out of prison and he came home for a week and then he disappeared. Next we knew he'd been killed. Shot in an ambush on the British Army that went wrong some way. Oh, I'm sorry, Belle. Well, it was sad. Sad for Mum especially. And honestly, I hardly knew him. But the funeral was big, a big IRA funeral. They fired a volley of shots over his grave. They were very good to my Mum. But she had nothing to stay in Ireland for, really. My dad's parents were great. But Mum said they wouldn't miss us when they had 8 children and 17 grandchildren. So about 6 months after Dad was killed, we moved to Salisbury, where Mum had originally come from. I guess it was good for me because life was more normal in Salisbury than in Belfast. Mum had all her old friends, of course, and my grandparents were still alive. My granddad, he was a Jew, but he'd done the unforgivable and married a Gentile, so his Polish-Jewish family disowned him. He used to tease me. He said I must be the only Jewish-Irish Republican living in Salisbury. She laughed. Grandad, when I was about 15, he died. That upset me more than my dad. I did love my dad, but we never got to know each other, never got any time together. I respect him for doing what he believed in, and I think I do understand Irish politics better than my mum did, but my granddad was such a lovely man. I suppose I had time with him and he was such an interesting man. Gustav was thoughtful now. The only sound for a few seconds was the frogs, insects and the distant calls of an unidentifiable troop of animals or birds they heard often early at night, not nearby but in the forest somewhere. So why was he so interesting then, Bellinda? He read a lot. He knew a lot. History, nature, music were his loves. He didn't have much of an education, but he taught himself. Half the reference books in Salisbury Library have had his eyes dancing all over their texts. He played the piano, well, not very well. He really loved music, all kinds, classical, jazz, he even liked some rock music. But best of all, he used to take me birdwatching. Ah, so this is how you ended up doing environmental science. Well, I'm not sure, Gustav. Maybe it was passed on to me genetically, or maybe he just taught me by example, but life on this planet and its continued existence is something we both had a real interest in. I remember so well the first time he got me really excited about birds. I must have been 13 years old. It was a very warm day, probably late spring, and I had to go into school on the Monday and tell the teacher, Miss Axton, something about birds or animals, and I wanted him to take me to a zoo or Longleat Safari Park or somewhere like that in the area. He said he'd take me to see something really amazing within easy walking distance. Usually I used to spend Saturday afternoons with him and we often walked. Some days we went to Salisbury Market. Sometimes we went to the library on a bad wet day. Often though we walked. It seemed like we walked just for the sake of it and chatted. This time though he said he would find me something to write about that nobody in the class would know about at all. He came round to our house in James Street, had dinner with me, and then we headed off. I asked where we were going and he said, "Just follow me." It's funny really, I was just about 13 and when I was out with my mates from school I thought I was about 18, all dressed up and thinking I was so fashionable. When I was out with Grandad I felt like a little girl of 7. Not that he treated me like that, it was just the way I felt. Anyway, he took me along the river. We were about half a mile from it in James Street and we walked about a mile out of the city on the western bank of the river. Grandad had a bag with him and in the bag there was always some food. Things to keep us going when we were out of town, he'd say. He stopped along the riverbank where there was a place to sit and where we were partly concealed by a bush. Grandad reached into his rucksack and he took out a pair of binoculars. "What is it, Grandad?" I asked. "Just wait, Bal. Just wait," he teased me. We had a bar of chocolate and he gave me a cup of coffee tasting of plastic from his flask. We watched and I obediently waited. After half an hour of chatting in very low voices, he said joyfully as he raised the binoculars, "There's one, look, Bal, on that tree over there, on the branch, see him?" He handed me the binoculars. Wow, was I impressed. On a branch in the brightest sunlight, dripping with water and holding a beak full of fish, was a beautiful, almost metallic turquoise bird with bright chestnut down his front. "Oh, Grandad, he's gorgeous," I said. "So what is he, Bellinda?" Grandad asked. "A kingfisher, I guess." "Well done. Now do you see that hole in the bank over there? Yes, just to the left a little bit. That's where he and his missus are nesting. I've been watching them all week." We watched them for a couple of hours. Grandad told me all about them, showed me the field guide. I was enthralled, I was hooked. From then on, birds were not just birds, they were to be a major part of my life. The next Saturday he took me shopping. I wanted to go bird watching again, but he said, later. He took me into the London Camera Exchange in Salisbury and bought me my first pair of binoculars. Then we went to watch the kingfishers and everything else with wings along that stretch of the river. A few days later I received news of my gift subscription from Grandad to the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. "Do you like birds, Gus?" "Well, I feed them in winter with scraps from the kitchen, but I couldn't know them all like you. I like them, but I can see you don't just like them, you're passionate about them." He smiled at her. "Ordinary people just see a flutter of wings, but you see more than that." "Yes, I see a small life wound up in a complex ecosystem. I see a wing that is a miracle of design. I see colours that are the work of the finest artist." "Ah, and you're never bored sitting watching birds in some dreadful drafty place? I've always imagined that watching birds would be like sentry duty for a soldier. Hours of waiting for something to happen." "No, Gus, a river, a seashore, a forest, anywhere like that is never boring." She lifted her eyes to his. "There are birds everywhere, and often waiting for the birds, waiting for this bird or that bird that I've sometimes never seen has led me to see other things. Foxes, badgers, deer, hares, even a pine marten once." "Ah, I see, always worth it, yeah?" "Yes, always. But there is more. Watching the birds is a connection with our past." "You mean you believe in evolution?" "I don't mean that. I mean, when I watch a falcon dive, or a buzzard soar, I'm doing just what my ancestors must have done for centuries. That is in Ireland, Britain, and Israel." "I don't understand what you mean, Bal." "Well, it's like a time machine in a way. My Jewish ancestors certainly watched eagles. The Jewish part of the Bible talks about them.